And the U.S. is starving Cuba right now. Yeah, we're probably going to do a coup in Cuba pretty soon. Things are getting pretty bad over there. You think Hassan will save them? We can only hope. Marco Rubio has been holding secret talks with the grandson and caretaker of Cuba's aging de facto dictator, Raul Castro, as the U.S. places unprecedented pressure on Havana's regime. The talks between Rubio and Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro are bypassing official Cuban government channels. 41-year-old grandson. And his circle representing younger, business-minded Cubans for whom revolutionary communism has failed and who see value in rapprochement with the United States. Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? No, that's not what that means, and that's not what that was. You don't know about that thing. You're just typing stuff. That was a different thing. After 67 years of U.S. sanctions and Cuban mismanagement, the totalitarian government appears close than ever to collapse as the island teeters on the edge of humanitarian crisis. The power grid is failing, hospitals are limiting surgeries, food and fuel are increasingly scarce, tourism's drying up. Remember, we seized control of Venezuelan oil and directed it away from Cuba to Israel. That was a very on-the-nose bit, where we arrested Maduro and seized control of their oil tankers and then just drove it over to Israel. Wait, really? Yes. Trump's threatened sanctions on the island's other large oil supplier, Mexico. Yes, Mexico is sending aid over to Cuba.
Rubbish on the streets, bikes to get around, power only by torchlight. This, the state of Cuba, desperately running out of oil supplies because it's reliant on Venezuela for fuel, and the US blocking imports of oil from there threatens to grind this island to a halt. The problem is everywhere to be seen in Havana, and this, now a threat to public health. No fuel to power the rubbish trucks.
Now it's serious, critical, very critical. It's prone to causing diseases which are caused by garbage. Please do something about this.
And no fuel for homes, schools, hospitals, causing blackouts for much of the day. Cuba's iconic 1950s cars replaced by these electric bikes, the only way to get around in a...
Yeah, it's genuinely, it's really, 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 really bad. For decades and decades, Cuba has survived, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has survived in spite of the U.S. embargo, and in many respects has been a nice place and pretty good considering its circumstances. It's never been great, and the government has been pretty bad. Not just recently, but for decades. But it was, at the very least, like a place that you could go, you could travel there. It felt like a real country. But in the past couple of years, it has gotten really bad. I mean, Jesus. They don't have the fuel to run the trash trucks. I mean, yeah. Why is blockading a country legal? Well, we're America.
Country being choked off from its supplies. Life in Cuba has become almost unrecognizable for the Caribbean island, which usually attracts millions of tourists a year.
This is not going to make Cubans like America, lol. Unfortunately, most Cubans seem to be directing their displeasure towards the Cuban regime rather than America specifically. I'm not saying that Cubans like America. I'm saying that they would be favorable to a replacement of their management.
I used to be a driver. I used to drive in El Medron.
But to be fair, the Cuban regime has done a pretty bad job. So
I worked every day, but because of the gasoline and oil situation, we've had to take this alternative, find a tricycle to keep moving the population. There's no other way.
Cuba's communist ideology has put it at odds with the world's biggest superpower for years. It's now stuck between accepting White House demands or facing a crisis that could snowball into catastrophe.
No, the United States has just continued to embargo them and treat them as a terroristic threat for no reason. Cuba poses literally no threat to us. The idea that because there are differences in the way we run our economy, that means we get to starve them and block not only free trade between our businesses and theirs, but also prevent like aid from other countries is absolutely insane. This is not them being at odds with us. They pose no threat to us whatsoever. They're a tiny, poor nation in the Caribbean. This is all because, for one, we want to punish them for defying us, and for two, Marco Rubio really, 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 really wants to conquer Cuba.
Citizens. Trump says it needs to make a deal or face the consequences, seeing a potential chance for a Cuban government to fall.
Cuba is right now a failed nation, and they don't even have jet fuel to get for airplanes to take off. They're clogging up their runway. We're talking to Cuba right now. I have Marco Rubio talking to Cuba right now, and they should absolutely make a deal because it's really a humanitarian threat.
South America is a
Israeli tactics. Israel uses American tactics. So, yes.
region split at the moment, traditional alliances bending under the pressure of US involvement. These were much needed supplies from Mexico being shipped in last week. But its government now halting shipments after the US threatened tariffs against countries that send supplies to Cuba. But not everyone there agrees with the Scheinbaum administration, with demos against what some Mexicans say is economic suffocation for Cubans, and Chile's far-right president-elect saying it won't be lending Cuba a hand either.
I do not agree with giving direct economic aid to a government that has imposed a dictatorship for more than 60 years and has left the Cuban people in a very deprived, inhumane situation.
Russian tourists at the airport in Havana being repatriated, but while an inconvenience for its holidaymakers, this is potentially an opportunity for Russia itself, because Cuba now needs oil, and badly. Russia could be the one to provide it. With the US-Cuba relationship strained for decades, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, is seen to be ramping that up further, accused of a personal agenda or even a lifelong dream to
That is true. The president of Chile is literally the child of a Nazi party member, by the way. Yeah, I know.
exact regime change. Rubio, for his part, defending the aggressive stance to Bloomberg.
The fundamental problem Cuba has is it has no economy, and the people who are in charge of that country.
Again, we are literally starving them. I don't know. Like we're impossibly evil. Everyone. Yeah, I mean, I assume this doesn't need any like restatement here. I hope we all know. Like we are just starving the island to death, so that we have an excuse to do a coup attempt. Like it'll be in the history books. Notice, by the way, how basically no countries around the world are denouncing what we're doing, you know? Just pointing out our European allies have no problem with this. Nobody's doing anything. Nobody really seems to care. Scheinbaum cares. She's sending aid over. You know, Mexico's sending aid over. But yeah, by and large, nothing's being done. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody really cares.
Answering Cuba's distress signal, help arriving in Havana today in the form of 2 Mexican naval ships loaded with aid. Neighborly solidarity in the form of rice, beans, sardines, nearly 300 tons of powdered milk. But it's oil that Cuba so desperately needs and that Mexico couldn't send without risking retaliatory tariffs from the United States.
It's very important help for the Cuban people at this moment we are living through. There's a lot of need and uncertainty, and we don't know how long it'll go on like this.
Since Donald Trump announced an effective oil blockade at the end of January, the effects have been cascading through Cuba's society. Already denied Venezuelan oil since the U.S. raid on Caracas at the start of the year.
It's funny, Rubio's parents fled Batista. Yeah. The way Rubio talks about it, he makes it sound like his family fled Castro's regime. They actually fled Batista's, the fascist, the U.S.-backed fascist that Castro overthrew. But whatever. History doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Only power matters. Wait, really? Yes.
Situation growing ever more acute. Last week, rationing imposed on petrol to go with rolling power blackouts. Cuba relies on oil for more than 80% of its electricity generation.
People are buying 3 bags of charcoal at a time so they can cook when there's no electricity.
At the airport, jet fuel reserves all but exhausted. That's led to Canadian carriers unable to refuel for the return journey to cancel upcoming flights. Canadian and Russian airlines sending empty planes to repatriate stranded tourists. Canadian and Russian visitors making up nearly half of Cuba's vital tourism industry.
Man, it sure does suck the Cold War ended, huh? For all their faults, at least the existence of the Soviet Union prevented America from throwing its weight around like this. It's like the Cold War ended, so America no longer needed to war with the rest of the world over control for the Third World. And we were like, okay, now that we don't need to do war, we can just do neocolonialism. Like, we don't need to literally go into Afghanistan or Vietnam or whatever. All we have to do is impose like economic sanctions or like make deals with, you know, shock doctrine shit to make these lesser, poorer countries subservient to us. They can be our like externalized slave class, which we did, of course. We did this to Vietnam. We did this to Bangladesh. We did this to China. But now the American elites are like, dude, that's fucking gay and boring. You're telling me colonialism is when you do trade deals? Fuck that. We should invade countries again. And now we're doing it again, but for no reason this time. Like, we could make more money off of Cuba by just not embargoing them, not sanctioning them, letting them develop, and then doing normal trade, like as a regular country. But it's not even a matter of personal benefit. We're not benefiting from what we're doing in Venezuela. They're just doing it because it's fun. You know?
Had already been in steep decline in recent years.
In the end, everything is because of the lack of dialogue between the two governments. Ultimately, this is, as I say in the Cuban style, it's like a giant fighting with a child.
Down from the mountains, the conqueror comes.
A fight that's had little let-up since Fidel Castro's communist revolution of 1959. Through the botched invasion of the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban...
Remember, Castro was initially an ally of the United States. He traveled to the U.S., had friendly talks with our diplomats. It was the United States that decided to turn on him.
Missile crisis that threatened a nuclear war, then decades of embargo. Until the brief détente of Barack Obama's second term.
This is a new day. Es un nuevo día.
And Cuba is ready to fall. You know?
Yes. Now in his second term, President Trump has redesignated Cuba a state sponsor of terror, increasing the pressure on Havana. His Cuban-American Secretary of State seen as the architect of the policy.
Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Cuba?
Regime change?
Yes.
Oh, no, I think we would love to see the regime there change. We would like to. That doesn't mean that we're going to make it change, but we
remember 99 senators, every single Democrat but one, approved Marco Rubio's appointment into the presidential cabinet as Secretary of State.
would love to see it change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be of great benefit to the United States.
Cuba's President Miguel Diaz-Canel says he's ready for talks without U.S. pressure or preconditions. Mexico, China, Russia, all calling for resolution through dialogue. Reports in Moscow, too, that it is preparing to defy Washington by sending oil to its friends in Cuba. The Kremlin spokesman not denying that and noting the relative lack of U.S.-Russian trade right now that could be affected by U.S. tariffs.
I like how the framing here is that Russia's not denying the accusation that they're providing necessary resources to a besieged people. Russia, how do you plead to the accusation that you're giving oil to the country that America invaded another country to block the oil flow from? How do you respond to this grievous claim? Have you changed your opinion on unipolarity being better than what the Cold War was? I don't know. I would have to think a lot about it. It's possible that even if the Cold War never ended, the Soviet Union would end up being part of the, like, unitary capital bloc that exists today, because they weren't really socialist. I'm not really sure. It does kind of seem like we're speedrunning Oblivion, though. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard, like, genuinely, I don't really know. I know that's bad, I know this is bad. All I know is that we're in the bad timeline. Maybe there are other worse timelines. It's not good. It's not good.
Well, earlier I spoke to Francisco Pichon, who's the UN's resident coordinator in Cuba. I asked him how bad the situation was on the ground.
The energy and the fuel crisis that we are facing is really the main humanitarian risk multiplier at this moment. And we are not currently describing this as a full-scale humanitarian emergency, but the risk is concerning, and it requires a lot of close monitoring and a lot of preventive action, and that is what we are focusing on at the moment.
How many days or weeks does Cuba have before it runs out of fuel completely?
This is not very clear. There has been numbers of days that have been mentioned in the media. The government has last week announced a contingency plan to limit the use of fuel to very essential.
Hold on, this is a slightly older video. I want to go back to this more recent one, the one from 1 day ago. Unfortunately, it does kind of seem like there's nothing that can be done for Cuba. Nobody's stopping the United States. I do not know what Cuba could possibly do with no fuel being provided to them except through Russia, potentially, which is not sustainable. Yeah, I don't know what can be done there.
In control of that country, they don't know.
Notice Democrats don't talk about this at all.
How to improve the everyday life of
Remember,
their people.
we invaded Venezuela, and the statement from Hakeem Jeffries was like, "What the fuck? Why didn't Trump cue us in? We hate Maduro. Why didn't we get in on this?"
People without giving up power over sectors that they control. They want to control everything. They don't want the people of Cuba to control anything.
The result for Cubans is a dark
Wasn't that Schumer? I think, did both of them say it? Was it just Schumer?
uncertainty, with no surety of what's next or confirmation as to where help will come from, if at all. David Adler works for the left-wing activist group Progressive International. He's one of the organisers of the Nuestra America Flotilla that's taking aid to Cuba and was previously involved in similar missions to Gaza. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us, first of all, what you've been doing, and can you tell us about the mission of your organisation in Cuba and the aid flotilla that you're sending there?
With this escalating assault on the island and its people, we've taken ourselves a large coalition of popular movements, unions, parties around the world to hear that call of humanity and respond by launching a large mission by sea, by air, a flotilla to reach the shores of Cuba and to provide that critical humanitarian aid, those essential supplies, medicine and food, solar panels, for example, that its critical infrastructure needs right now to prevent a true humanitarian catastrophe that has been forewarned by high-ranking UN experts and officials.
I know you were in Cuba just a few weeks ago. How much has the situation there changed since then, and what were the limitations on aid specifically as well?
I think it's possible to overstate the consequences of a siege of this nature. This is not just any geopolitical instrument. This is not just any normal foreign policy. What we're looking at is the failure of really critical infrastructure that sustains daily life on the island. Stuff as simple as trash collection, but something as important as neonatal care.
If you look at action within Cuba over the last few months and years, though, there have been protests against blackouts, shortages before. This isn't just necessarily a US issue. The Cuban government...
Dog, the US has been sanctioning them this whole time. What do you mean? It's not just America. People were protesting blackouts a few years ago. Yeah, we've been doing this for like 70 years, since the 60s.
Continues to repress dissent and public criticism. So there is a history of this as well. You can't necessarily place it all on the US.
We've been embargoing them.
The Cuban government has long
more than half a
responsibility for critical policies that would provide for the well-being of their people. There's no shortage of criticism, open discussion, and dialogue on the island about that. But let's be abundantly clear. This is in plain black and white, written into State Department memos and cables reaching back for 60 years of the U.S. blockade, where the explicit goal of U.S. policy is to strangle the island, inflame hunger and desperation that would lead to the type of social unrest that could cause the collapse of the regime. I would call on people to really question, before we normalize these tactics of siege in utter and explicit violation of international law, why are we doing this? What threat does Cuba represent to the U.S. American people? What threat does Cuba represent to the international community, a country that has led medical brigades and provided for the poor all across the world throughout the history of its revolution since 1959.
What do you make of the international response to this crisis then? Has Cuba been abandoned by its traditional allies, particularly in South America as well?
One of the things we've seen in recent days is governments, increasingly wake up. Those allies of Cuba, historical allies of Cuba, wake up to this humanitarian crisis. Morena and the government of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, for example, sending humanitarian aid. The government of Gabriel Boric promising to do so, as well as the government of Pedro Sanchez. But
she's pretending like we're not preventing Mexican oil ships from getting there. We literally have threatened sanctions on Mexico if they continue providing aid to Cuba. Like, we are locked the fuck in on this. Anyway, yeah, sorry. There's not really like a good ending to this or anything. It seems like I don't really see an outcome here. There's no pressure domestically or internationally on the United States, and we seem to have pretty much infinite leeway here. So I don't know. This is the Chud grandson of Raul Castro, who Marco Rubio is having secret talks with. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Wonder how much info there is in this guy. When I Google his name, all I see is people talking about the secret talks. I don't know how much info there is in his like political beliefs. They might not be entirely relevant.